She had an accident and fell from a cliff. A grizzly bear heard her cries and did the unexpected. Granite Ridge National Park sprawled across northern Montana like a cathedral of stone and silence. Ancient and unbroken pines towered over frostbitten earth, their trunks black with age, their crowns shivering under early spring snow. The air smelled of resin and wind-scoured stone. Somewhere far above, a golden eagle carved lazy circles in the pale sky, its cry lost in the immensity of the wilderness. Elellanar Hayes, 45 and hard-edged in frame but soft-eyed from years of watching the land instead of conquering it, adjusted the strap of her weather-worn camera and squinted toward the ridgeline. She had tracked the signs for nearly 3 days, scat with berry skins, claw marks fresh on an aspen trunk, the overturned stones near a shallow stream. All evidence pointed to something rare and vital, a grizzly family, possibly a mother and 2 cubs. But the male she had seen, prints larger than dinner plates, and she knew he was still out there. The same male from years ago. She never forgot the day she'd found him caught in an illegal snare, his massive foreleg twisted grotesquely in rusted steel. She had no backup, no sedative, just a hacksaw, her voice, and an absurd hope that he wouldn't kill her for trying. He hadn't. He watched her with something she couldn't name, not trust, not gratitude, but something close. She'd freed him, and he'd limped away without looking back. She called him Bruno, though no other ranger ever confirmed the sighting. Now, years later, with her ranger uniform folded in a box at home and a controversial development plan threatening to gut this very ecosystem, Elellanar returned, determined to capture something irrefutable. If she could document the bears, show the public the majesty that would be lost, perhaps she could stop them from bulldozing paradise. She hiked with steady, deliberate movements, the same rhythm she'd kept since her 20s, though her knees reminded her with every incline that she wasn't quite as invincible as she once believed. The ridge rose ahead, sunlit and steep, a patchwork of melting snow and exposed granite. As she climbed, the wind bit at her cheeks, but the adrenaline of purpose warmed her blood. She stopped near a narrow ledge and raised her camera, focusing on claw marks etched deep into a birch. Then it happened. Her boot, slick from snowmelt, skidded on loose gravel. The world tilted. There was no time to cry out. She fell. The drop wasn't sheer, but brutal enough. She tumbled through shrubs and rock, her camera flying from her grip, her body colliding again and again with unforgiving earth. Pain bloomed, hot and jagged. She landed hard, her back slamming into a downed log, her head snapping sideways against a boulder. The sky above blurred into spinning light. When she opened her eyes, the world was still, but her body screamed. Her right leg was twisted at an angle that defied anatomy, and blood leaked warm and slow from a gash near her scalp. She tried to move but only managed a breathless gasp. Her ribs felt splintered. She lay sprawled beneath the trees, the ridge now a distant wall of shadow and ice. The sun dipped behind a bluff, and with it, the temperature plummeted. She fumbled for her radio, but the static was useless. No signal this deep, and no one knew she was here. She'd gone alone on purpose. The decision now curled in her gut like poison. As dusk spread its ink across the sky, sounds began to stir around her, rustling whispers in the underbrush, then the low, hungry yips of coyotes. They were close. She could smell them before she saw them, musky, lean, driven by winter's hunger. A pair emerged from the shadows, sinewy and snarling, their yellow eyes reflecting moonlight. Elellanar reached for a stick with her good arm, feebly swinging it. The coyotes circled, emboldened. Her breath turned shallow, the edges of her vision growing dark. She wasn't ready for this to be the end, not like this, not torn apart and forgotten beneath a pine sky. She closed her eyes. A growl answered, not from the coyotes. This one was deeper, thunder drawn into sound. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. From the edge of the glade emerged a behemoth, gray-muzzled, hulking, eyes the color of burnished copper. Elellanar's heart stopped. Bruno. He was larger than she remembered, a king of the mountains cloaked in fur, weathered by seasons and scars. The coyotes shrank instantly, whimpering, backing away. Bruno didn't run or bluff. He advanced with the certainty of a force that feared nothing, sending the coyotes scrambling into the underbrush. When silence returned, Elellanar blinked, disbelieving. The bear turned to her. For a moment, she wondered if her mind had conjured him. But then he stepped closer. His nose twitched, scenting the blood. He didn't lunge, didn't growl. He just sat, massive and still. His breath steamed into the freezing air, each exhale slow and grounded. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Bruno tilted his head slightly, as if assessing her injuries. Then he did something that would later be dismissed by skeptics as fantasy. He lowered himself beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his fur. Carefully, he pressed his flank against her side, a barrier between her shattered frame and the creeping frost. She wept then, not from fear, but from something else, something ancient. She drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the sound of his heartbeat, slower than any human's, like the pulse of the earth itself. She heard wolves once in the distance, but they did not approach. Nothing came close to the scent of a dominant grizzly. The night passed in frozen silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches and Elellanar's rasping breath. When dawn broke, she couldn't feel her toes. Her leg throbbed with every beat of her heart. Her lips were cracked, bloodied. But she was alive. Bruno stirred. He stood and walked a few paces away, nosing around something hidden in the brush. She could barely lift her head to follow his movements. Then he returned, nudging a wooden object with his paw, a log sled, half buried, the kind left behind by ranger crews after trail maintenance. She didn't understand at first, but he returned to her, nudging gently at her hip. Not to harm, to move. She let herself go limp, and with painstaking patience, the old bear coaxed her onto the sled. It was crude, but it held her weight. He turned then, gripping the sled's rope, left attached and half frozen, and began to pull. Slowly, powerfully, through snow and bramble, in shadow. Elellanar lost consciousness, but the last thing she saw was his silhouette against the rising sun. Moving, always moving, as if he knew where salvation lay. Bruno moved with the patience of the mountains themselves. Each step deliberate, each pull of the sled dragging Elellanar farther from death and closer to something like hope. The makeshift sled groaned beneath her weight, the rough wood scraping over root and stone. But Bruno never faltered. His muscles rippled beneath his thick coat, dusted with frost and streaked with blood. Not his own, but Elellanar's. Her blood had soaked into the grain of the sled, staining it a dark, glistening red, a trail marking their journey through the wild. Snow flurries whispered around them, clinging to the air like a breath half-held. Elellanar drifted in and out of lucidity, her mind flickering between sharp pain and soft fragments of memory. A summer rainstorm in Glacier Valley, her father's flannel jacket, a young cub caught in a poacher's trap, trembling as she approached with bolt cutters and a prayer. Bruno. The realness of him. She tried to lift her head once to see his back as he pulled, but her neck gave a violent throb of protest. She collapsed back, her breath hitching. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this couldn't be real. Bears didn't rescue people. They didn't remember. But the groan of the sled against the frozen ground said otherwise. And the silence, the vast, reverent silence of the forest around them, seemed to honor something sacred that was unfolding in their shared, improbable journey. Let me know if you want this formatted or styled differently, otherwise, it's all grammatically polished and kept exactly as you asked. The forest canopy thinned as Bruno led her out of the deep woods and into a clearing where winter light spilled across the snow like liquid silver. Tracks crisscrossed the ground, moose, fox, snowshoe hare, but none ventured near the single wide path carved by a determined bear and the human he refused to leave behind. Time twisted, Elellanar's sense of it frayed. Morning blurred into afternoon as they pressed on, mile after impossible mile. Her body ached in places she couldn't name, pain blooming like frostbite through every nerve. At one point, she tasted blood in the back of her throat and wondered if her lungs were failing. Her fingers curled and stiffened. Still, Bruno pulled. Around midday, clouds rolled in, dragging a bruised sky overhead. The wind shifted, whistling through skeletal trees and rattling loose bark. A crow cawed harshly from a branch overhead. Bruno paused, sniffing the wind, his ears flicking toward the horizon. Elellanar blinked, just awake enough to wonder if he was sensing danger or orientation. Then, with a huff, he pressed on, faster now, as if something had shifted. A distant structure came into view, faint at first, just the outline of walls and a sloped roof nestled against the base of a ridge, but unmistakably man-made. The old ranger outpost. It was rarely used this time of year, left open for emergencies, stocked with a first aid kit, flares, and a crank radio. Elellanar had helped build it in her 30s. She remembered driving nails into timber with wind-numbed fingers and swearing under her breath. Now, it might be the only thing that stood between her and death. Bruno trudged forward, his paws sinking slightly into the snow as they neared the cabin. When they reached the front, he stopped. Eleanor's body shifted slightly on the sled as he turned, sniffing the door. He paced once, then reared up on his hind legs and shoved against the wooden frame. The door creaked open a few inches. The bear dropped back to all fours, huffing from exertion. The sled bumped forward as he pulled her to the threshold, and then, miraculously, inside. The cabin was cold, dark but sheltered. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by the sudden movement. Bruno stood over her for a moment, chest heaving, tongue lolling as he panted. Then he turned and lumbered out into the snow, disappearing for a few minutes. When he returned, he held something awkwardly in his jaws, a pack. Eleanor's old ranger pack, the one that had been thrown clear in the fall. He dropped it beside her, then sat back on his haunches and stared at her, as if to say, "I've done all I can." She tried to move her arm, just barely, to reach the emergency latch on the wall. Her fingers brushed the wood, too weak to push. Bruno leaned forward. With a strange gentleness, he nudged her shoulder with his nose, repositioning her closer to the wall. The latch clicked. A light flickered to life above the door, solar-powered, just enough illumination to show the crank radio and first aid supplies in the corner. Elellanar let out a broken breath, a sigh disguised as an exhale. She was going to live. She didn't remember much after that, only scattered flashes, the sterile sting of disinfectant, the static crackle of the radio as she called for help, the sound of a helicopter days later. By the time the rescue team arrived, Bruno was gone, vanished into the wild as silently as he had come. The rangers found the sled, the blood, the tracks leading from the base of the cliff to the outpost. They found tufts of gray fur snagged on branches, deep claw marks in the ice where Bruno had pulled her across impossible terrain. But no one believed her. Not at first. Bears didn't do this. Bears avoided humans or killed them. They didn't save them. She was delirious, they said. The trauma must have created a hallucination. But then the camera footage surfaced. Trail cams Elellanar had set earlier in the week captured part of it, Bruno approaching her crumpled form, the coyotes circling the charge. Blood samples at the site matched both Grizzly and human. And the sled, her blood, his fur. A miracle. The story broke the internet within a week. The bear who saved a woman. Bruno the Guardian. News outlets begged for interviews. Wildlife biologists debated ethics, instinct, anomaly. But Elellanar didn't care about fame. She cared about the land and what was at stake. She contacted her niece Clara, a fierce environmental attorney in Bozeman, and together they prepared for war. The development company, Stout Enterprises, had been greasing palms and falsifying reports. Elellanar had proof. Photos of snare traps, ecological surveys doctored to show reduced bear populations, drone footage of illegal construction vehicles operating beyond permitted zones. At the town hall hearing, Eleanor stood, cane in hand, her body still healing. She showed the video footage of Bruno standing beside her, the trail of his journey through snow and silence. He remembered me, she said. He protected me. He saved my life. I won't let his home be destroyed. When Stout himself approached her afterward with a smirk and a suitcase full of hush money, she hit record on her phone before he could blink, his threats, his bribe, it was all there. Clara leaked the audio. The town turned. The state filed injunctions. The permit was revoked. Elellanar didn't cry the day they announced the formation of the Granite Ridge Bear Sanctuary. But when she walked to the perimeter weeks later and saw the first protected signs go up, when she found Bruno's prints in the snow along the ridgeline, she smiled so hard her ribs ached. Bruno, ever the ghost, never came close. But once, just once, she saw him at the treeline, watching her with those burnished eyes. Then he turned and disappeared into the pines, as if he'd simply been waiting to make sure she was still standing. Snow lingered late into the spring that year, clinging to the shadows of the pines and seeping cold through the mountain soil. But the fire that burned in Eleanor Hayes's heart was impervious to frost. The town of Eagles Rest had not seen a gathering like this in years. Every folding chair at the courthouse filled, every wall lined with silent watchers, ranchers, scientists, schoolteachers, and loggers alike. Clara stood at the front, poised and clear-eyed, the kind of woman who could gut a corporate exec with a smile and a single line of legal code. Elellanar sat beside her, cane in hand, her legs still bound in a brace and her ribs a constant ache beneath her coat. But pain no longer ruled her. Not after what she had survived. Not after what Bruno had done. Clara spoke first, laying out the facts, map overlays, environmental impact reports, illegal logging evidence, drone footage of machinery tearing paths through protected wetlands. Then Eleanor stood, slow but sure, and silence fell like a snowfall. She didn't begin with numbers or laws. She began with a story. Her voice, worn and low, carried weight as she described the fall, the pain, the night she thought would be her last. She described Bruno, the moment their eyes met again after all those years, the heat of his body pressed against hers in the snow, the sound of his breath anchoring her to the world. She told them about the sled, about the journey, about waking beneath the flickering solar light in the outpost cabin and realizing she was alive because something wild and ancient had chosen to remember her. Gasps rose when Clara played the footage from Eleanor's trail cams, the bear defending her from coyotes, standing sentry, and then the images of his journey, frame by frame, Bruno dragging her broken body across the snow-covered wilds. A man in the back muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. "This isn't about sentiment," Elellanar said, straightening her back despite the spike of pain that shot through her side. "It's about proof. This land supports life that is irreplaceable. It carries memory. It carries connection. You destroy it for profit, you don't just erase trees, you erase a future where coexistence is still possible." There was a long pause. Then she added, quieter, "I don't expect you to believe every word. But the forest believes it. And Bruno, he's real." The room sat hushed until the opposing lawyer rose, slick-suited and smirking. He challenged her memory, accused her of romanticizing wild behavior, claimed it was dangerous to imply wild animals were anything but unpredictable threats. But then Clara stood again, holding up her phone. "This is a recording made 3 nights ago," she said. The room listened as Calvin Strahd's voice played, smooth and venomous, offering hush money to Elellanar, mocking the public, sneering about nuisance bears and how easy it was to falsify reports. When it ended, the courthouse erupted, not with chaos, but with an energy, a unifying spark that lit in the marrow of the townspeople. A local rancher stood and said, "You don't get to call yourself part of this land if you poison it." Another added, "My grandfather trapped in these woods. He never saw a bear do what she says, but he always said the forest remembers." "I believe her." Strahd's face turned an alarming shade of red, but the tide had turned. Days later, the governor's office issued a formal halt on all Granite Ridge development, pending federal investigation. Elellanar barely made it back to her cabin before the tears came, not of sorrow, but release, a dam breaking somewhere deep inside her. Clara stayed a few days longer, helping organize the influx of donations and volunteers flooding into the new sanctuary effort. Local kids painted signs. Hikers offered to run trail cams. Biologists reached out from across the country. And in the heart of it all, Elellanar wrote. She took to her small wood stove warm study every morning, her fingers stiff but purposeful, transcribing memories, reflections, the long and winding path from isolation to salvation. Her memoir took shape like clay on a wheel, slow, imperfect, but full of soul. She titled it Wild Mercy, The Bear Who Remembered. Publishers scrambled for it the moment excerpts hit the local paper. It wasn't just a story. It was a testament. And yet, as the noise of media and legislation buzzed around her, Elellanar felt a different pull, not toward fame or justice, but toward the treeline, toward the wilderness. She hiked again, slower now, but with the same reverent rhythm in her step. She followed no trail. She listened to the wind, the murmur of leaves, the dry crackle of elk moving unseen through the brush. She watched the horizon, especially at dusk, when light softened and the world held its breath. And one day, near a ridge she hadn't visited since the fall, she saw him. Not close, not clear, but unmistakable, Bruno, standing at the far edge of a clearing, his massive frame caught in the golden light of sunset. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. He watched. She watched back. A full minute passed, maybe more. Then he turned, his shoulders rolling like thunderclouds, and slipped into the trees without sound. Eleanor didn't follow. She couldn't. That wasn't their way. They were not pet and master. They were not storybook companions. They were something else, something wordless, something older than language, forged in trust, in pain, and impossible grace. The sanctuary blossomed over the months. Rangers returned to patrol, not as wardens, but as stewards. Tourists came with respectful awe instead of conquest. A new plaque stood at the trailhead to Pine Ridge in honor of Bruno, whose mercy rewrote what we thought we knew. And back in her cabin, Elellanar lit a fire each night, her dog-eared field journal stacked beside her. Her camera returned to the shelf where it belonged. She no longer needed proof. The land spoke for itself. 1 year later, almost to the day, autumn arrived again. Gold spilled from the aspens and the sky sharpened into that endless Montana blue. Eleanor stood on her porch, a mug of coffee in hand, her brace now long gone, but the faint ache in her bones still a steady reminder. She didn't expect to see him again. But she hoped. And as the morning mist lifted from the valley, something moved near the tree-line. A great gray bear, not alone this time. A smaller one, a yearling maybe, followed at a respectful distance. Then another, cubs, almost grown. Bruno's family. He turned once, looked back, not toward his cubs, but toward her, as if to mark this moment, to burn it into whatever memory a bear carries. Elellanar raised her hand, though she knew he wouldn't see the gesture clearly. He stood there for a breath longer. Then, like smoke through pine, he vanished. Elellanar whispered, "Goodbye, old friend." Not in sorrow, but in reverence. Their story had ended where it began, in the hush between heartbeats, in the space between fear and faith. In a world that so often forgot its wildness, theirs was a bond that would be remembered. Autumn deepened its grip on the Montana highlands, painting the forest in hues of rust and fire, the aspen leaves trembling like fragile gold coins before surrendering to the wind. From her cabin window, Eleanor Hayes watched the season shift, her breath fogging the glass as she sipped her coffee and felt the pulse of time, both tender and ruthless, beat against the world outside. It had been a year since Bruno saved her life. A year since she lay broken in the snow and watched death circle, only to be shielded by something no science or faith had ever fully explained. The sanctuary now thrived. What began as a whispered dream had grown into something rooted, protected, fiercely loved by the community that once nearly lost it. The land was watched, tended, but not owned. And the animals came and went freely. Mountain lions, moose, the occasional wolf pack that moved through like shadows, and, of course, the bears. Bruno was seen occasionally on trail cams, mostly appearing like a myth made real, moving with that same quiet power through the evergreens. But he never came close again. That was their understanding. Their connection hadn't needed daily confirmation to remain alive. Elellanar felt it always, a presence just beyond reach, like music heard through a closed door. She finished her coffee, set the mug down, and pulled on her flannel-lined coat. Outside, the air was crisp, the ground littered with brittle leaves, and somewhere in the distance a raven called out across the ridgeline. She walked with her old ranger gait, slower, but certain, her cane slung across her back now, more habit than need. Her leg ached in the mornings, and her ribs still clicked when she breathed too deep. But she was strong again, in the ways that mattered. That day she wasn't heading to the sanctuary's edge or the public trails. She was hiking a familiar route, one that wound past old fire scars and fallen logs up toward a quiet outcrop she and her late husband had called Lookout Point. It was a sacred place, high and hidden, overlooking the entire northern basin of Granite Ridge. She hadn't returned there in years, not since he passed, not since the weight of solitude grew heavier than the comfort of memory. But today felt right. With a pack on her shoulders and her camera hanging at her side, she moved through the underbrush, pausing often not for breath but to listen, to witness. A flicker darted past her shoulder, its wings flashing white in the sun. A deer raised its head in a nearby glen, then returned to grazing. The land was alive, unbothered by her presence, the kind of peace only granted when one walks not above nature but within it. When she reached Lookout Point, the view struck her breathless, as it always had. The valley below unfurled like a living map, rivers carving silver threads through dark forests, distant peaks crowned in snow, the sanctuary boundary marked only by the presence of life thriving, untouched. She sat on the flat stone slab near the edge, legs crossed, the sun warm on her shoulders. From her pack, she pulled out the finished draft of her memoir, its cover marked with soil and coffee stains, pages dog-eared and loved. Wild Mercy had been published 6 months ago and, to her quiet disbelief, had become a phenomenon, not because it was sensational or dramatic, but because people had been starved for a story that didn't end in violence or domination. A story where a bear was not a monster, not a metaphor, but something real, something capable of connection. Letters had poured in from readers around the world, children who now dreamed of being rangers, scientists who felt reinvigorated, elders who said they finally believed in something again. It was beautiful. It was also heavy, the kind of weight that meant responsibility. Elellanar had been asked to speak across the country, to sit on panels, to accept awards. She had gone to a few, but she always returned to Granite Ridge. This was her heart, her pulse, her place. She set the manuscript beside her and pulled out a small hand-carved bear figurine, something she'd whittled herself from driftwood found near the river. It was rough, misshapen, but its posture was right, strong shoulders, proud head, heavy paws planted firmly in the earth. She held it in her palm for a long moment, then placed it gently on the edge of the outcrop, a silent offering, a thank you. The wind picked up, tugging at her coat, rustling the pines. She closed her eyes. Somewhere just beyond sound, she could almost hear the low, steady breathing of a great bear. That night back at her cabin, she lit a fire and watched it dance in the hearth. Her old dog Murphy curled at her feet, snoring softly. Outside, stars filled the sky like snowflakes in reverse, endless and eternal. She wrote until late, not the memoir now, but letters to old friends, sketches of the land, poems that had waited years to find words. She had never called herself a poet, but lately words spilled from her like water from a spring. As the clock crept toward midnight, she stepped onto the porch and looked east toward the ridgeline. Fog had settled low, silvering the trees. And there, just beyond the timberline, she saw him, not as a dream, not a shadow, but Bruno. Alone again, his fur pale with age, his body slower now but still colossal. He stood facing her, not approaching, not retreating. Around him moved 2 younger bears, full-grown now, likely his sons or challengers drawn to his territory. One of them bristled and took a step toward him, teeth bared. Bruno didn't fight. He turned slowly and walked away, not out of fear, but out of knowing. The land had changed. His time as guardian had passed. He left the clearing, melting into the forest with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. Elellanar watched him go, her hand on her heart. He hadn't come back for help. He hadn't come for farewell. He had come to show her that even kings stepped down, that the wild moved forward even as it remembered. Weeks passed. Winter teased the edges of the mountains again. The sanctuary closed to tourists for the season. The last volunteer packs loaded out. Eleanor stayed, as always, in her cabin with the creek that never froze and the pines that bent like prayer. She walked the trails alone, fixed cameras, refilled feed stations, left bundles of sweet grass near denning sites, not to tame, but to honor. Every so often, she'd find a track, a print wide as her outstretched hand, sunk deep into snow. Not Bruno's anymore, but his legacy. Other bears, born into protected soil, living without fear. She smiled at each one. Life goes on, the forest whispered. It always does. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it leaves something behind. A story. A memory. A bond. Elellanar sat at her desk one morning in January, snow falling soft against the windows, and began a new book. Not about bears this time, but about people. About what happens when you remember you're part of the world, not above it. About mercy. About wildness. She paused after the first page, listening. A crow called once, far away. Then silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with everything she had ever loved, ever feared, ever been saved by. She smiled, picked up her pen, and wrote on. The snow was deep that March, even for Granite Ridge, falling in heavy silence that blanketed the forest like a dream suspended in white. It softened every edge, hushed every sound, and transformed the sanctuary into something holy, a cathedral of trees and sky and stillness. Elellanar Hayes stood at the edge of the frozen meadow near Clearwater Creek, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat as she gazed across the wide expanse of white. Her boots sank with every step, her breath rising in steady clouds, but her eyes were sharp, clear, watching. She had returned to this place not with expectation, but with reverence. It had been over a year since Bruno's final appearance, since she watched him disappear into the woods, surrounded by younger bears staking claims in the world he once ruled. She knew she would not see him again. The land had a way of honoring quiet farewells. There were no long goodbyes in the wild, no lingering exchanges, just presence and then absence. But today was different. She could feel it in her bones, not as an ache, but as a current moving beneath her skin. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of fur and frost and something older, something buried deep in memory. She moved forward, step by step, through the clearing, her cane tapping lightly when needed, her camera forgotten in its pouch. The trees ahead opened into a small hollow she had visited many times during her patrol days, a place where the creek bent close to a granite shelf, pulled into a mirror of sky. In spring, deer would gather here to drink. In summer, trout flickered in the shallows. Today it was frozen over, still and white, but not empty. Tracks led across it, fresh, wide, deliberate. Grizzly. Not Bruno's. She knew his stride, the spacing of his gait, the depth of his impression. These were smaller, younger, but strong. And beside them, just briefly, barely visible, was a print that made her breath catch, larger, heavier, faded now, softened by wind and time, but unmistakable. Bruno had come this way, once, maybe days ago, maybe weeks. She knelt beside the print, her gloved fingers hovering over the shape. It felt like reaching out to a ghost and finding warmth instead of emptiness. She didn't cry. She smiled, a slow, private thing. She sat in the snow beside the track, pulled a thermos from her coat, and sipped hot coffee as the forest held her like a friend. She imagined him walking this path in twilight, the sun bleeding gold through the trees, his shoulders rolling with age but still proud, his breath misting like smoke against the cold. Perhaps he came here one last time to see what had become of the land. Perhaps he stood right where she sat now and listened to the stillness. Perhaps he knew it was safe, that it would remain, that his story had passed into hands that would hold it with care. The wind whispered through the branches above, and for a moment she thought she heard a low huff, the kind he used to make when content, when watchful. She closed her eyes and let the sound echo in her chest. When she finally rose, brushing snow from her coat, she didn't look back. She walked slowly, deliberately, her path not carved by urgency but by memory, each step a kind of offering to the land that had shaped her. The days that followed moved quietly. Winter began to loosen its grip. Sap ran thick through the pines again, and the first signs of melt peeked from beneath the snow. Elellanar spent most mornings writing, but not the kind of writing the world would ever read. These were letters to the land, to Bruno, to the girl she used to be when she first put on her ranger badge, terrified and full of longing, desperate to prove she belonged. She no longer needed proof. She had been tested by the wild and found worthy, not because she conquered it, but because she listened. Because she saw. On the anniversary of the fall, the day she slipped from the ridge and broke against the earth, only to be carried home by a creature no one could explain, she returned to the outpost. The old cabin stood just as she remembered it, though the roof had been repaired and new solar panels now fed power to a stronger radio. The sled Bruno used to drag her was still there, preserved by the sanctuary board and tucked under the eaves like a relic. She ran her hand along the wood, now weathered to silver gray. Her bloodstains had long since faded, but she could still see them in her mind. She opened the cabin door, stepped inside, and sat by the stove, which she quickly lit with practiced ease. As the warmth spread, she placed a small carved bear figurine, another one, this one made from old pine, on the shelf above the hearth. No words, no plaque, just the shape of something wild and watchful. That night, she dreamed of him, not the brutal dream of his roar or charge, but something gentler. He stood in a field bathed in moonlight, his fur rippling in the wind, his eyes steady and bright. Around him stood other bears, cubs grown tall, mothers watchful, young males learning the shape of the world. He looked at her once, gave a single nod, and turned away. She woke with a tear slipping down her cheek and a heart full of peace. Spring came like a whisper, soft and green and sudden. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows. Birds returned in flocks. The sanctuary reopened, and Elellanar watched as families arrived, children with wide eyes and quiet steps, walking the trails with reverence. Rangers led them through the woods, pointing out tracks, scat, claw marks, the subtle signs of life hidden in the undergrowth. Her book became required reading in several schools. Young rangers wrote to her, thanking her for reminding them that protection wasn't about dominion but about love. And though she smiled at every letter, every child's drawing of Bruno, every article or interview request that landed in her mailbox, she kept the truest parts of her story to herself, not out of secrecy, but because some things belong only to the soil and the soul. On the first warm day of May, Elellanar took her final hike of the season. She walked up the same trail she'd climbed on that fateful day years before, her steps steady, her gaze lifted. The forest welcomed her without ceremony, as it always had. At the top, where the wind rolled over the ridge and the sky opened wide, she sat and looked out over the expanse of protected land. The light was golden, the air full of birdsong and the faint rustle of new leaves. And though she saw no sign of him, she knew Bruno was part of it all, his blood in the roots, his breath in the wind, his story in the loam. He was not gone. He had become the land itself. As she sat there, the sun on her face, she whispered into the breeze, "Thank you for everything." Then she stood, turned toward home, and walked into the quiet with a heart both full and light, knowing that their story would live on, in the tracks left in snow, in the hush of pine, in every child who learned to look at the wild not with fear, but with wonder.